On July the 4th, 1776, the Declaration of Independence was signed, and with it, the birth of a new nation. One of the men who signed that document was sent across the sea to France, seeking aid for the American cause. His name was Benjamin Franklin, who was 70 years old, with a head of white hair and a heart full of determination. The French people welcomed him with open arms, throwing feasts and parades in his honor. Crowds followed him through the streets, and his likeness was displayed everywhere. The French were charmed by his simplicity and directness, and he won a warm place in their hearts. On one great occasion, a beautiful woman was chosen to place a crown of laurel upon his head and give him 2 kisses on his cheeks. It was a sincere expression of admiration and esteem. Franklin did much to secure aid from France, rendering services to his country that could be compared to those of George Washington. He represented his country ably for 10 years before leaving France in 1785. All of France was sorry to see him go, and the king sent one of the queen's litters to carry him to the coast, as he could not endure the motion of a carriage. He also carried with him a portrait of the King of France, framed in a double circle of 408 diamonds. In his last years, Franklin endured much idleness and pain, but he remained patient and cheerful, loving life until the end. He died in 1790 at the age of 84, one of the greatest statesmen and heroes of America. Chapter 16. George Washington, the Virginia planter and the Revolutionary soldier. We departed from the esteemed George Washington at his grand plantation, Mount Vernon, situated on the Virginia side of the Potomac River. Following his marriage to Mrs. Custis, who possessed a significant amount of property, Washington became a very wealthy man. At one point, he was among the largest landowners in America. As the overseer of all this property, he had much to manage. Let us pause our tale for a moment to catch a glimpse of the lifestyle led by him and other Virginia planters of his era. The plantations were dispersed along the rivers, sometimes miles apart, with densely wooded areas lying in between. Each planter had their own dock from which ships transported their tobacco to England once a year, and brought back whatever manufactured goods they required. Nearly all their needs could be met at their dock or on their plantation. Their slaves included not only laborers in vast tobacco fields, but also skilled tradespeople such as millers, weavers, tailors, wheelwrights, coopers, shoemakers, and carpenters. Washington instructed his overseers, "Do not purchase anything that you can produce yourselves." Each plantation was a miniature world unto itself. As a result, towns with shops offering various goods and supplies did not emerge much in Virginia. The planter's mansion, constructed of brick or wood with a massive chimney at each end, was 2 stories tall, with a spacious veranda outside and a broad hallway inside. Nearby were storehouses, barns, workshops, and slave quarters. The latter consisted of modest wooden cabins, surrounded by gardens where sharecroppers grew vegetables and watermelons for their own consumption. In reality, the mansion and all the buildings clustered around it resembled a village. Here, at all hours of the day, we could have observed swarms of sharecroppers playing joyfully together. The planters spent the majority of their time outdoors, accompanied by their dogs and horses. Washington bestowed his horses with rather fanciful names, such as Ajax, Blueskin, Valiant, and Magnolia, and his dogs with names like Vulcan, Sweetlips, Ringwood, Forester, and Rockwood. Outdoor activities included fishing, hunting, and horse racing. Life on the plantation was not luxurious, but it was abundant in its plain and homely way. Visitors were always welcomed with warmth and hospitality. It was not uncommon for a planter to host an entire family for weeks, and then return the visit with his own family. Social life took up much of Washington's time at Mount Vernon, where visitors were a constant presence. Living miles away from other human habitation, planters were eager to have travelers stay the night and bring news of the outside world. Such visits were akin to receiving a newspaper in our homes today. It is important to remember that traveling was not as simple then as it is now. As Virginia planters usually lived on the banks of a river, the easiest method of travel was by boat, either up or downstream. Cross-country roads were rough and sometimes full of roots and stumps, and often nothing more than forest paths. Travelers sometimes lost their way and had to spend a night in the woods. Despite these challenges, planters had their lumbering old coaches, which they harnessed 6 horses to on state occasions and drove in great style. Washington was fully immersed in this way of life and threw himself into managing his vast property. He lived by his favorite motto, "If you want a thing done, do it yourself." He kept his own books and paid close attention to even the smallest details. He was one of the most methodical men, accomplishing a remarkable amount of work. He rose early, often before daylight in winter, kindling his own fire and working by candlelight. He had a simple breakfast of 2 cups of tea and hoe cakes made of Indian meal. After breakfast, he rode on horseback over his plantation to oversee his slaves, often spending much of the day in the saddle supervising their work. He ate dinner at 2, took tea in the early evening, and went to bed at 9 o'clock. As he did not spare himself, he expected faithful service from everyone. However, to his many slaves, he was a kind master, taking good care of the sick or feeble. It may comfort some of us to learn that Washington preferred an active life to reading books, for which he never seemed to have much time. But he was even less fond of public speaking. Like some other great men, he found it difficult to stand before a body of people and make a speech. After his service in the French and Indian War, he was elected to the House of Burgesses, where he received a vote of thanks for his brave military services. Rising to reply, Washington stood blushing and stammering, unable to say a word. The speaker, equal to the occasion, said with much grace, "Sit down, Mr. Washington. Your modesty equals your valor, and that surpasses the power of any language to express." For many years after the close of the last French War, this modest, home-loving man lived the life of a high-bred Virginia gentleman. However, the exciting events that finally brought on the Revolution were stirring men's souls to heroic action. It was natural in these trying days that his countrymen should look for guidance and inspiration to George Washington, who had been a conspicuous leader in the last French War. He represented Virginia at the first meeting of the Continental Congress in 1774, traveling to Philadelphia in the company of Patrick Henry and others. He was also a delegate from his colony at the second meeting of the Continental Congress in May 1775. On being elected by this body as Commander-in-Chief of the American Army, he immediately thanked the members for the election and added, "I do not think myself equal to the command I am honored with." He also refused to receive any salary for his services, but said he would keep an account of the expenses he might incur, so that these might be paid back to him. On the 21st day of June, in the year of our Lord, 1775, George Washington, mounted on horseback and accompanied by a small group of horsemen, departed from Philadelphia. His destination was the American army stationed around Boston. Not long after beginning his journey, a messenger arrived in haste with news of the Battle of Bunker Hill. Washington eagerly inquired, "Did the Americans withstand the fire of the regular troops?" The proud response was, "Yes." Washington exclaimed joyfully, "Then the liberties of the country are safe." 3 days later, on a Sunday afternoon, Washington arrived in New York to a royal welcome. Riding in an open carriage drawn by 2 white horses, he was escorted by 9 companies of soldiers on foot through the streets. The people, young and old, received him with enthusiasm. In New Haven, the students of Yale College came out in a body, marching to the music of a band led by Noah Webster, the future lexicographer, who was then a freshman. On July the 2nd, after arriving at the camp in Cambridge, Washington received an equally enthusiastic welcome from the soldiers. The next day, General Washington rode out on horseback, and under the famous elm still standing near Harvard University, drew his sword and took command of the American army. He was 43 years old, with a tall, manly form and a noble face. He was a perfect picture of manly strength and dignity, wearing an epaulet on each shoulder, a broad band of blue silk across his breast, and a 3-cornered hat with the cockade of liberty in it. Now came the labor of getting his troops into good condition for fighting battles, for his army was one only in name. These untrained men were brave and willing, but without muskets and powder, they were in no condition to make war on a well-equipped enemy. Furthermore, the army had no cannon, without which it could not hope to succeed in an attack on the British troops in Boston. By using severe measures, however, Washington soon brought about much better discipline. But with no powder and no cannon, he had to let the autumn and the winter slip by before making any effort to drive the British army out of Boston. When cannon and other supplies were at last brought down from Ticonderoga on sledges drawn by oxen, the alert American general fortified Dorchester Heights, which overlooked the city, and forced the English commander to sail away with all his army. Washington believed that the British would next try to gain control of the Hudson River and the Middle States, so he promptly went to New York to defend it against attack. However, his army was weak in numbers, provisions, equipment, and training. Washington had only about 18,000 men to face General Howe, who arrived off Staten Island with a large fleet and 30,000 men. Not knowing where the British general would strike first, Washington had to be on his guard at many points. He had to prepare a defense of a line of 20 miles. He also built Forts Lee and Washington on opposite sides of the Hudson River just above New York. When Brooklyn Heights on Long Island had been fortified, General Putnam went with half the army to occupy them. On August the 27th, General Howe, with about 20,000 men, attacked a part of these forces and defeated them. If he had continued the battle by marching at once against the remainder, he might have captured all that part of Washington's army under Putnam's command. He might also have captured Washington himself, who during the heat of the battle had crossed over to Long Island. If Howe had done this, he might have ended the war in one stroke. But his men had fought hard at the end of a long night march and needed rest. Besides, he thought it would be easy enough to capture the Americans without undue haste. How could they escape? Soon the British vessels would sail up and get between them and New York, when, of course, escape for Washington and his men would be impossible. This all seemed so clear to the easy-going General Howe that he gave his tired men a rest after the battle on the 27th. On the 28th, a heavy rain fell, and on the 29th, a dense fog covered the island. But before midday of the 29th, some American officers riding down toward the shore noticed an unusual stir in the British fleet. Boats were going to and fro, as if carrying orders. "Very likely," said these officers to Washington, "the English vessels are to sail up between New York and Long Island to cut off our retreat." As that was also Washington's opinion, he secured all the boats he could find to try to make an escape during the night. It was a daring feat that would test the mettle of any man. 10,000 soldiers, and a river almost a mile wide to cross. It seemed impossible that they could make it across without being detected by the British troops, who were camped just a short distance away. The night must have been long and tense for General Washington, who stayed at his post on the Long Island shore until the last boat had departed. But they did it. They made it across, and it was a brilliant victory that saved the American cause. But that was just the beginning of Washington's troubles in 1776. With the British now occupying Brooklyn Heights, the Americans had to withdraw, fighting fiercely as they retreated. Washington crossed the Hudson River to the Jersey side, leaving General Charles Lee with half the army at North Castle. The British captured Forts Lee and Washington, along with 3,000 soldiers, dealing a severe blow to the American cause. The outlook was grim, but worse was yet to come. To prevent the British from capturing Philadelphia, Washington placed his army between them and the city. The British began to move against him, and he needed every soldier he could get. He sent orders to General Lee to join him, but Lee refused to move. Washington pleaded with him time and time again, but Lee continued to disobey. It was later revealed that Lee was a traitor, secretly hoping for Washington to fail so that he could become commander-in-chief of the American army. Lee's disobedience put Washington in a precarious position. To save his army from capture, he had to retreat once again, this time across New Jersey toward Philadelphia. The British army, far superior to Washington's, was hot on their heels, and it was a race for survival. Sometimes the rear guard of the Americans was just leaving a burning bridge when the British army appeared on the horizon. But by burning bridges and destroying food supplies intended for the British, Washington was able to delay them, and they took 19 days to march just 60 miles. The situation for the Americans was dire. To make matters worse, Washington watched as his army dwindled due to desertion. By the time they reached the Delaware River, they numbered a mere 3,000 men. However, Washington was not one to give up easily. He collected boats for 70 miles along the Delaware River and successfully crossed it a little above Trenton on December the 8th. The British, lacking boats, were forced to wait until the river froze, intending to cross and capture Philadelphia with ease. Most people in England and America believed that the American cause was doomed to fail. Even General Cornwallis, who had joined the British Army in America in May of that year, was so sure of victory that he had already packed some of his belongings to return to England. But Washington was not disheartened. He faced the bleak outlook with courage and energy, watching for an opportunity to strike a heavy blow against his overconfident enemy. And that opportunity soon presented itself. The British general had carelessly separated his army into several divisions and scattered them throughout New Jersey. One of these divisions, consisting of Hessians, was stationed at Trenton. Washington quickly noticed this mistake and decided to attack the Hessians on Christmas night. With a reinforced army of 6,000 men, Washington was in a better position to risk a battle. He prepared to cross the Delaware River at a point 9 miles above Trenton with 2,400 picked men. The ground was covered in snow, and the weather was bitterly cold. Some soldiers marched with almost bare feet, leaving bloody footprints along the route. At sunset, the troops prepared to cross the river. It was a treacherous night for such a task. Fierce gusts of wind and massive blocks of ice, carried by the swift current, threatened to shatter the fragile boats at any moment. From the Trenton side, General Knox, dispatched by Washington, bellowed instructions to guide the struggling boatmen to shore. The crossing took 10 grueling hours. For Washington, standing amidst the raging storm, his heart filled with a mix of anxiety and hope, it must have felt like an eternity. It wasn't until 4 in the morning that the troops were ready to march on Trenton, 9 miles away. As they advanced, a brutal storm of snow and sleet pelted the already exhausted men. But they persevered, and after a brief struggle, surprised and captured the Hessians at Trenton soon after sunrise. Washington had breathed new life into every patriot's heart. The British were stunned by this daring feat, and Cornwallis decided to prolong his stay in America. He soon advanced with a superior force against Washington, and at nightfall on January the 2nd, 1777, took his position on the far side of a small creek. "At last," said Cornwallis, "we have caught the old fox, and we will trap him in the morning." But Washington was too cunning a fox for Cornwallis to catch. During the night he led his army around Cornwallis's camp and, pushing on to Princeton, defeated the rear guard, which had not yet joined the main body. He then retreated safely to his winter quarters in the hills around Morristown. Throughout this fateful campaign, Washington masterfully led his army. He had started with defeat and ended with victory. In 1777, the British devised a plan to control the Hudson River, thereby cutting off New England from the other states. They hoped to weaken the Americans to the point of defeat. Burgoyne was to march from Canada, via Lake Champlain and Fort Edward, to Albany, where he would meet not only a small force of British under St. Leger from the Mohawk Valley, but also the main army of 18,000 men under General Howe, who was expected to sail up the Hudson from New York. The British believed this plan would be easily executed and would soon bring the war to a close, and it might have come to pass, had General Howe not failed in his duty. Instead of joining forces with Burgoyne, he chose to march through New Jersey and capture Philadelphia. But upon reaching Morristown, he found Washington entrenched in a position that he dared not attack. As Washington refused to engage in open combat, and Howe was unwilling to advance with the American army threatening his rear, he retreated to New York. However, still determined to reach Philadelphia, he sailed with his army to Chesapeake Bay, a voyage that took 2 months. Upon finally advancing towards Philadelphia, Howe encountered Washington at Brandywine Creek, where a battle ensued resulting in the defeat of the Americans. Nevertheless, Washington's strategic maneuvers forced Howe to take 2 weeks to travel the mere 26 miles to Philadelphia. Upon arriving, Howe discovered that it was too late to aid Burgoyne, who was in dire straits. Washington had foiled the English plan, and Burgoyne, without the much-needed assistance from Howe, was forced to surrender his entire army of 6,000 regular troops at Saratoga on October the 17th, 1777. This was a significant blow to England, leading to a treaty between France and America. Following the treaty, France sent both land and naval forces, which proved to be of great service to the American cause. At the close of 1777, Washington retreated to a fortified position at Valley Forge, located on the Schuylkill River, approximately 20 miles northwest of Philadelphia. Here, his army endured a winter of unimaginable suffering. Most soldiers were in tatters, with only a few possessing bedclothes, and many without even straw to sleep on at night. Nearly 3,000 were barefoot, and they often went days without bread. The hardships these patriotic men endured during this miserable winter are heartbreaking to read about. Despite the bitter trials of these distressing times, Washington never lost faith in the ultimate success of the American cause. A wondrous tale is told of this masterful man at Valley Forge. As friend Potts was near the camp one day, he heard an earnest voice. Upon approaching, he saw Washington on his knees, his cheeks wet with tears, praying to God for help and guidance. When the farmer returned to his home, he said to his wife, "George Washington will succeed. George Washington will succeed. The Americans will secure their independence." "What makes you think so, Isaac?" inquired his wife. "I have heard him pray, Hannah, out in the woods today, and the Lord will surely hear his prayer." "He will, Hannah. You may rest assured he will." We shall pass over without comment here the events between the winter at Valley Forge and the Yorktown campaign, which resulted in the surrender of Cornwallis with all his army. Even when not engaged in fighting battles, Washington was the soul of the American cause, which could scarcely have succeeded without his inspiring leadership. But there is yet one more military event, the hemming in of Cornwallis at Yorktown, for us to notice briefly before we take leave of Washington. When at the close of his fighting with General Greene in the South, Cornwallis marched northward to Yorktown, Washington, with an army of French and American troops, was encamped on the Hudson River. He was waiting for the coming of a French fleet to New York. On its arrival, he expected to attack the British army there by land, while the fleet attacked it by sea. Upon hearing that the French fleet was on its way to the Chesapeake, Washington thought out a brilliant scheme. This was to march his army as quickly and as secretly as possible to Yorktown, a distance of 400 miles, there to join Lafayette and cooperate with the French fleet in the capture of Cornwallis. The scheme succeeded so well that Cornwallis surrendered his entire army of 8,000 men on October the 19th, 1781, and so it was that the final battle of the war had been fought, though the Treaty of Peace would not be signed until 1783. With that treaty, the Americans secured their independence from England. The land they could now call their own stretched from Canada to Florida, and from the Atlantic Ocean to the Mississippi River. Washington, weary from the long years of war, was eager to return to his life as a Virginia planter. But he was not to be granted peace and quiet. As he wrote in his diary 2 years after the Revolution's end, his home had become a well-resorted tavern. Even so, he found moments of solitude, such as when he dined alone with Mrs. Washington for the first time since his retirement from public life. When the time came to elect a president for the newly formed United States, all eyes turned to George Washington. He was elected without opposition and inaugurated in New York, then the capital of the nation, on April the 30th, 1789. As president, Washington carried himself with dignity and grace. He did not make social calls or accept invitations, but he did hold a public reception every Tuesday afternoon. On these occasions he appeared in court dress, with powdered hair, yellow gloves, a long sword and a white polished leather scabbard at his side, and a cocked hat under his arm. He stood with his right hand behind him, bowing formally as each guest was presented to him. After serving 2 successful terms as president, Washington retired once again to private life at Mount Vernon. He passed away on December the 14th, 1799, at the age of 67, beloved and revered by the American people. Chapter 17. Nathaniel Greene, the hero of the South, and Francis Marion, the swamp fox. The course of the Revolution as it pertains to Washington has been briefly examined. However, to fully comprehend the sequence of events, we must acknowledge the contributions of the brilliant military leader, Nathaniel Greene, who is widely regarded as second only to Washington. As previously mentioned, the initial battles of the Revolution occurred in New England. When the British were unsuccessful in gaining control of the region, they shifted their focus to the Hudson River and the Middle States, but to no avail. Their attention then turned to the South, where many Tories were willing to support the King's forces. King George III had high hopes of conquering all of the southern states and claiming them as English territory, even if the Americans were able to retain possession of New England and the Middle States. In 1778, the British began their campaign in Georgia, capturing Savannah. However, it wasn't until 1780 that they made a serious attempt to conquer the South. In May of that year, General Lincoln, the American commander of the Southern Army, surrendered his entire force at Charleston. In August, General Gates led a second American army into battle at Camden, resulting in a devastating defeat. The outlook for the Patriot cause was bleak. It was clear that a capable military leader was needed to lead the Americans, or the British would soon triumph over all opposition. Washington had great confidence in General Greene's abilities, and promptly selected him for this crucial task. Nathaniel Greene was born in Warwick, Rhode Island in 1742. His father was a Quaker preacher who worked as a blacksmith and miller during the week. Nathaniel was raised with strict Quaker principles, and was trained to work in the fields, mills, and forges. He was a robust and athletic individual who excelled in outdoor sports. From a young age, he was studious and as an adult, eagerly studied military tactics in anticipation of the impending conflict with England. In 1774, a man by the name of Greene played an active role in the formation of a military company known as the Kentish Guards, located in Rhode Island. He immediately enrolled himself as a private. However, to obtain a musket, he had to make a journey to Boston. Dressed in his Quaker attire of drab-colored clothing and a broad-brimmed hat, he observed the British regulars performing their customary drill. Upon his return, he brought with him not only a musket, which he concealed under some straw in his wagon, but also a British deserter to train his company. Upon hearing the news of the Battle of Bunker Hill, a brigade of 3 regiments was raised in Rhode Island, and Greene was appointed as its leader with the rank of brigadier general. With this brigade, he immediately marched to Boston. When Washington arrived to take command of the American troops, General Greene had the honor of welcoming him on behalf of the army. At the time, General Greene was 33 years old, 6 feet tall, with a strong, vigorous body and a frank, intelligent face. He quickly gained the friendship and trust of Washington, who later placed him in positions of great responsibility. Throughout the entire war, General Greene was actively engaged, and in all his campaigns he displayed remarkable energy and promptness. It was only natural that a general of such ability would be sought out in 1780 as commander of the American army in the South. When General Greene arrived in the Carolinas on December 2, 1780, he found the army in a dismal state. There was only 1 blanket for every 3 soldiers, and there were not enough provisions in camp to last 3 days. The men were disheartened. They had suffered defeat, rebellious because they were unpaid, and sick because they were unfed. They camped in crude huts made of fence rails, corn stalks, and brushwood. In his masterful way, Greene quickly gained the trust of both officers and soldiers. An anecdote perfectly illustrates the faith his men had in him. One day he saw a barefoot sentry and remarked, "You must suffer from the cold." The sentry replied, unaware that he was speaking to his commander, "I do not complain. I know I would fare well if our general could procure supplies." Soon after taking command of the army, Greene dispatched General Morgan with 900 elite soldiers to the mountains in the Carolinas to threaten British posts. Meanwhile, Greene himself positioned the rest of the army closer to the coast on the Pedee River. General Cornwallis, in charge of the British Army in the South, sent Tarleton to attack Morgan. On January 17, 1781, after a grueling night march, Tarleton, overconfident of victory, attacked Morgan at Cowpens. However, the Americans repelled the attack with great force and won a brilliant victory. The British lost 230 killed and wounded, and 600 prisoners, nearly their entire force. Cornwallis was deeply disappointed, as he had expected Tarleton to crush the American force. He now planned to march quickly across the country and defeat Morgan before Greene's army could unite with him. However, Morgan, certain that Cornwallis would make a strong effort to overwhelm him and rescue the 600 prisoners, marched as quickly as possible in a northeasterly direction, intending to cross the Catawba River before Cornwallis could catch up. Furthermore, when Greene heard the glorious news of the American victory, he knew that Morgan's force was in great danger of falling into the hands of Cornwallis. He therefore planned not only to prevent such a catastrophe, but also to lead Cornwallis far away from his base of supplies at Wilmington on the coast, to a place where his force, united with Morgan's, could win a decisive battle. With these plans in mind, Greene ordered General Huger to march rapidly in a northerly direction with the army. Greene himself, with a small guard, rode swiftly a distance of 150 miles across rough terrain to reach Morgan's army. On the last day of January, he arrived in the Catawba Valley and began directing its movements. Meanwhile, Cornwallis, with desperate energy, was relentlessly pursuing the Americans. For the next 10 days, it was a race for life, with the odds in favor of Cornwallis. But Greene was exceedingly alert and masterful. The Catawba River had been safely crossed, but Cornwallis might overtake the Americans before they could cross the Yadkin River. To make all possible provisions for a speedy crossing, Greene sent men ahead to ensure that boats would be collected on this river, ready for use when he should need them. He also had the foresight to carry boats mounted on wheels with his army. When crossing a river, these boats would carry the wheels, and in advancing across the country, the wheels would carry the boats. Having taken these precautions, Greene sent Morgan forward toward Salisbury, while he waited for a force of militia that was to guard fords on the Catawba to delay Cornwallis. But while waiting, he heard that the militia had been scattered. When this unfortunate news reached him, he started upon a solitary ride through the heavy mud and drenching rain in search of Morgan's force. When Greene arrived at the Salisbury Inn, which had been turned into a hospital for the soldiers, the army physician greeted him, asking how he was. "Fatigued, hungry, alone, and penniless," he answered. The landlady, Mrs. Elizabeth Steele, on hearing the reply, brought out 2 bags of money, the savings of many a hard day's labor. She said, "Take these. You will need them, and I can do without them." In this famous retreat of 200 miles through the Carolinas, the Americans forded 3 rivers, whose waters, swollen by recent rains soon after the Americans had crossed, checked the British in their pursuit. Greene crossed the last of these rivers, the Dan River, with the 2 parts of his army now united, just in time to escape Cornwallis. In all this time of trial and uncertainty, General Greene received valuable aid from partisan leaders in the South. One of the most noted of these was Francis Marion, who was born near Georgetown, South Carolina, in 1732. Although as a child he was extremely delicate, he grew strong after his 12th year. In his mature years, he was short and slight in frame, but strong and hardy in constitution. When the British first swarmed into South Carolina, a man named Marion rallied his neighbors and friends to form a company known as Marion's Brigade. These men were some of the bravest and best of the Revolutionary soldiers, despite lacking uniforms, tents, and pay. They fashioned sabers from old saws beaten at the country forge, and bullets from pewter mugs and dishes. Their diet was simple, with their leader Marion usually eating hominy and potatoes, and drinking water flavored with a little vinegar. One day, a British officer entered their camp with a flag of truce. After a conference, Marion, with his usual delicate courtesy, invited him to dinner. The officer was surprised when they were served a meal of roasted sweet potatoes on pieces of bark. He was even more surprised to learn that Marion's men sometimes didn't even have potatoes to eat. Marion's brigade, made up of farmers and hunters, rarely numbered more than 70, and sometimes as few as 20. Despite their small size, they annoyed the British by rescuing prisoners and capturing supply trains, foraging parties, and outposts. One day, a scout reported that a party of 90 British with 200 prisoners were on the march for Charleston. Marion waited for darkness to conceal his movements, then sallied out with 30 men. They swooped down upon the British camp, captured the entire force, and rescued all the American prisoners. When hard pressed by a superior force, Marion's men scattered, each one for himself, and dashed headlong into the dense, dark swamps, meeting again at a well-known hiding place. Sometimes, even while the British were searching for them, they would dart out suddenly and surprise another British party nearby. Marion earned the name Swamp Fox from the British, and his bravery and resourcefulness inspired many. With the aid of cunning partisan leaders and masterful army tactics, General Greene proved to be more than a match for the formidable Cornwallis. When reinforcements arrived from Virginia, Greene launched an attack on his enemy at Guilford Courthouse in North Carolina, where he ultimately suffered a defeat. However, despite the setback, Greene had inflicted such damage on the British army that Cornwallis was forced to retreat to the coast in search of supplies for his half-starved troops before marching northward into Virginia. Throughout this grueling campaign, Greene had consistently outmaneuvered Cornwallis. At the end of the war, as he made his way home through Philadelphia, the people greeted him with great fanfare and admiration. In 1785, he relocated with his family to a plantation gifted to him by the state of Georgia. There, he lived a peaceful and contented life for less than a year before succumbing to a fatal sunstroke at the age of 44. His comrade Wayne, who was by his side at the time of his passing, spoke of him in glowing terms. "He was a great soldier, a great citizen, and an impeccable friend. I have witnessed the passing of a truly great and noble man." Chapter 18. Daniel Boone, the Kentucky Pioneer. In the year 1756, at the onset of the last French War, the English colonies were confined to the narrow strip of land between the Allegheny Mountains and the Atlantic Ocean. This remained the case until the Revolutionary War. To comprehend how the western boundary was extended to the Mississippi by the end of the Revolutionary War, we must focus on the early western pioneers, the backwoodsmen, who provided vital services to their country. One of the most renowned pioneers was Daniel Boone, born in Bucks County, Pennsylvania, in 1735. He cared little for books and spent most of his time hunting and fishing. The woods were his passion, and he became an expert marksman. Legend has it that as a young boy, he wandered into the forest some distance from home and built himself a rough shelter of logs. He would spend days at a time with only his rifle and game for company. The rifle brought down the game, which he cooked over a fire of logs. He slept on a bed of leaves with the skin of a wild animal for a cover. This free, wild life prepared him for his future career as a fearless hunter and woodsman. When Daniel was about 13 years old, his father moved to North Carolina and settled on the Yadkin River, where Daniel grew up. After marrying at the age of 20, he built a hut in the wilderness, far from other settlers' homes. But Boone was restless. For years he gazed longingly at the rugged mountains to the west and the unknown country beyond. His desire to explore this wild region grew day by day until he could no longer contain it. By the time he was 25, he had begun his explorations and had pushed his way as far as Boone's Creek, a branch of the Watauga River in eastern Tennessee. Near this creek, there still stands a beech tree with the inscription, "D. Boone silled a bar on this tree in the year 1760. 9 years later, Daniel Boone, accompanied by 5 other men, set out on May the 1st to traverse the Allegheny Mountains. For 5 weeks these intrepid explorers made their way through the untamed wilderness. But when they arrived in Kentucky in June, they were rewarded for their hardships with a land of great beauty and abundance. The forests were teeming with game, including deer, bears, and vast herds of bison. They quickly constructed a shelter made of logs, open on one side, which they called their camp. The floor of this camp was the earth, covered with leaves and hemlock twigs. 6 months after their arrival, Boone and a man named Stewart had a harrowing experience. While on a hunting expedition, they were captured by a party of Indians. For 7 days the warriors kept a close watch on their prisoners, but on the 7th night, after gorging themselves on the day's catch, the Indians fell into a deep sleep. Boone, pretending to be asleep, seized his chance. He quietly got up, woke Stuart, and the two crept away until they were out of earshot. Then they sprang to their feet and ran like deer through the dark woods towards their camp. When they arrived, they found it deserted, and they never learned what had happened to their companions. Several weeks later, Boone was pleasantly surprised by the arrival of his brother, Squire Boone, and a companion. The four men lived together without incident until one day when Stuart was ambushed and killed by Indians. The surviving companion was so terrified that he abandoned the wilderness life and returned home. Boone and his brother remained in the forest for 3 more months, but their ammunition was running low. On May the 1st, Squire Boone returned to North Carolina for fresh supplies and horses, leaving Daniel alone, 500 miles from home. His life was in constant danger from wild animals and Indians. He dared not sleep in his camp, but instead sought refuge in a canebrake or other hiding place, where he lay concealed, not even lighting a fire for fear of being discovered. During these months of solitary waiting, Boone endured many hardships. He had no salt, sugar, or flour, and his only food was game he hunted with his rifle. But in July his brother returned with much-needed provisions, bringing him great joy and relief. After 2 years of living in the wilderness, Daniel Boone returned to his home on the Yadkin River to prepare for his move. In September of 1773, he sold his farm and was ready to take his family to settle in Kentucky. Boone's enthusiastic reports of the fertile land he had explored were met with eager listeners. When his party was ready to depart, it included 5 families, 40 men, and enough horses and cattle to sustain them. Unfortunately, they were attacked by Indians on their journey, resulting in the deaths of 6 men, including Boone's eldest son. Discouraged by this setback, the party returned to the nearest settlement, and the migration westward was postponed. Despite the tragedy, Boone remained determined to settle in the beautiful Kentucky region. The land had already become historic, with the Indians referring to it as a dark ground and a bloody ground. An old Indian chief had recounted to Boone how many tribes had hunted and fought on its disputed territory. Although no tribe held an undisputed claim to the land, Boone's friend Richard Henderson and other white men made treaties with the powerful Cherokees, who allowed them to settle in Kentucky. Once it was certain that the Cherokees would not interfere, Henderson sent Boone in charge of 30 men to open a pathway from the Holston River over Cumberland Gap to the Kentucky River. This pathway became known as the Wilderness Road, which thousands of settlers would later use to make their way westward. Upon reaching the Kentucky River, Boone and his men built a fort on the left bank of the stream, which they named Boonesboro. The fort's 4 stout walls consisted of the outer sides of log cabins, and a stockade made of timber pieces thrust into the ground and pointed at the top, standing 12 feet high. All the cabins had loopholes, and a loopholed blockhouse was at each corner of the fort. Daniel Boone, the leader of this settlement, was a man of fascinating character. He stood tall and lean, a backwoodsman with muscles of steel and a rugged nature that allowed him to endure great hardships. He was a quiet and serious man, possessing a courage that never faltered in the face of danger. Men trusted him because he trusted himself. Furthermore, his kind heart and tender sympathies earned him lasting friendships. He typically, though not always, dressed like an Indian, sporting a fur cap, a fringed hunting shirt, and leggings and moccasins, all fashioned from the skins of wild animals. If we were to imagine ourselves inside Daniel Boone's log cabin, situated in the clearing not far from the fort, we would find it to be a modest home with rudimentary furnishings. A ladder leaned against the wall, serving as the stairway to the loft where the children slept. Pegs driven into the wall held the meager family wardrobe, and the family meal was spread out on a rough board supported by 4 wooden legs. There was an abundance of plain and simple food. Bear meat was a substitute for pork and venison for beef. As salt was scarce, the beef was not salted down or pickled, but was jerked by drying in the sun or smoking over the fire. Corn was also a vital staple in their diet. When away from home to hunt game or to follow the war trail, sometimes the only food the settler had was the parched corn he carried in his pocket or wallet. Every cabin had its hand mill for grinding the corn into meal, and a mortar for beating it into hominy. The mortar was made by burning a hole into the top of a block of wood. A young pioneer lad found his life to be a busy and fascinating one. Even in his youth he received careful instruction in the art of imitating the calls and songs of birds and wild beasts. He learned the craft of setting traps and the skill of shooting a rifle with unerring accuracy. At the tender age of 12, he became a fort soldier, with a porthole assigned to him for use in the event of an Indian attack. He also received careful training in tracking Indians and concealing his own tracks when on the warpath. Such expert knowledge was essential in the face of danger from unseen foes who might creep stealthily upon the settlers at any time, whether they were working in the clearings or hunting in the forest. After constructing the fort, Boone returned to his home in North Carolina to fetch his family. Some months after the family arrived at Boonesboro, Boone's daughter and 2 of her friends were floating in a boat near the riverbank, when suddenly 5 Indians emerged from the woods and seized the 3 girls, carrying them away. When the Indians noticed the eldest of the girls breaking twigs and dropping them in their trail, they threatened to tomahawk her unless she stopped. But the girl, watching her chance, tore off strips of her dress and dropped them as guides for the pursuing settlers. As soon as Boone heard of the capture, he and 7 other men from the fort set out on the trail of the Indians and pursued them until, early on the second morning, they discovered the Indians sitting around a fire cooking breakfast. Suddenly, the settlers fired a volley, killing 2 of the Indians and frightening the others so badly that they beat a hasty retreat, leaving the girls unharmed. In early 1778, Boone and 29 other men were captured and taken away by a band of Indian warriors. At that time, the Indians in that part of the country were fighting on the side of the English in the Revolution, and as they received a ransom for any Americans they might hand over to the English, they took Boone and the other men of his party to Detroit. In the early days of Kentucky, the English offered a sum of $500 for the release of Boone, who had been taken captive by the Indians. However, the Indians refused to let him go, as they held him in high esteem. Instead, they took him to their home and performed a ceremony to adopt him into their tribe. They removed all of his hair except for a tuft on the top of his head, which they adorned with feathers and ribbons as a scalp lock. They then threw him into the river and scrubbed his body thoroughly to wash out all the white blood. After painting his face in the traditional Indian fashion, they were pleased to see him as one of their own. Boone lived with the Indians for several months, making the best of his situation. However, when he learned of their plan to attack Boonesboro, he knew he had to escape and warn his friends. He left secretly before sunrise on June the 16th and arrived at Boonesboro on June the 20th after traveling 160 miles with only 1 meal. He dared not use his gun or build a fire for fear of being discovered by his foes. When he arrived at the fort, he was able to help beat off the attacking party. This was just one of the many close calls that Boone experienced. On another occasion, while he was in a shed tending to some tobacco, 4 Indians with loaded guns appeared at the door. They taunted him, saying that he would not get away this time and that he would not cheat them again. Boone quickly gathered up some dry tobacco leaves and filled the Indians' eyes and nostrils with the dust. While they were coughing and sneezing, he made his escape. Despite all of his dangerous adventures, Boone always emerged unscathed. He remained the leader of the settlement at Boonesboro for many years, and was a masterful leader in the early pioneer life of Kentucky. He never lost his love for the solitude of the wilderness, even in his old age. Boone passed away in 1820 at the age of 85. It is said that without him, the settlement in Kentucky would not have been possible for many years. Chapter 19. Thomas Jefferson and the Louisiana Purchase. In the early days of America, pioneers and settlers like Daniel Boone paved the way for the United States to acquire the land between the Allegheny Mountains and the Mississippi River. However, the territory between the Mississippi River and the Rocky Mountains was obtained in a different manner, through purchase. And the man who played a crucial role in this acquisition was none other than Thomas Jefferson. Born in 1743 on a plantation near Charlottesville, Virginia, Jefferson inherited his father's physical strength and energy, which gave him a hardy constitution. As a young boy, he enjoyed hunting for game, swimming in the nearby river, and riding his father's horses. He was a skilled and daring rider, and his love for horses stayed with him throughout his life. At the age of 5, Jefferson began his education, which instilled in him a lifelong habit of reading and studying. Even as a young boy, he was known for his industry and thoroughness. At 17, he entered William and Mary College in Williamsburg, Virginia. Despite the village's small size, it was the state capital, and represented the most aristocratic and refined social life of the colony. Jefferson took full advantage of this good society while studying hard, sometimes for as much as 15 hours a day. His strong body and sound health helped him withstand the severe strain of his studies. Jefferson's simple, refined, and gentle manner, combined with his cheerful disposition and rare intelligence, made him many warm friends. One of his closest friends was Patrick Henry, who was known for his jokes and stories that kept everyone in good humor. Jefferson and Henry spent many hours playing their violins together, enjoying each other's company.